The morning dawned gently over the green hills of Wessex, as the dew sparkled like tiny pearls on the grass. The birds' songs filled the air, and the first rays of sunlight caressed the rooftops of the humble Anglo-Saxon homes. In the midst of this charming landscape, a boy with lively eyes and light brown hair ran barefoot through the fields, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if sensing that his life was destined for something greater than the land where he was born. His name was Winfried. Born into a noble family, Winfried grew up surrounded by tales of warrior heroes, ancient kings, and the legends of his people. But unlike other boys who dreamed of wielding a sword and conquering far-off lands, he felt a strange pull toward the stories of saints and martyrs that he heard from his mother's lips. Each night, when the family gathered by the fire, she would tell stories from the Gospels, and little Winfried, wide-eyed, would ask again and again why those men and women had given up everything for an invisible faith. "Mother, is there really a treasure in heaven more precious than land and jewels?" he asked one night as shadows danced across the walls. His mother gently stroked his hair. "Yes, my son. There is an eternal treasure that neither moth destroys nor thief steals away. It's the love of God and the joy of serving Him." The boy held those words in his heart, like a seed that, though unseen, would begin to grow over the years. As Winfried grew, he became a studious young man, thirsty for knowledge. He wasn't satisfied with what he learned at the monastic schools of Exeter and Nursling. He devoured sacred texts and the writings of the Church Fathers, eager to understand the mystery that led holy men to leave everything behind. Yet deep within him burned a restlessness he couldn't shake. Was it enough to teach and preach in his homeland when, across the sea, entire peoples still didn't know Christ? One night, as he gazed up at the starry sky, Winfried felt a stirring in his soul. The words of the gospel echoed in his memory. "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations." It was then that he understood his calling wasn't to stay, but to go. He felt the pull to cross the sea and enter wild lands where gods of stone and wood still ruled men's hearts. He knew it would be a hard path, filled with dangers, but he also sensed that this was the path that would give his life true meaning. This is how the story began of the man the world would come to know as Saint Boniface, the Apostle of Germany. A man who would leave behind his Anglo-Saxon name, his homeland, his comforts, and even his own life to bring the light of the gospel to the edges of the empire. His story would be woven through letters and chronicles, through heroic deeds and shed tears, through quiet miracles and bold decisions. A story that would echo through the centuries as the testimony of a soul who answered the call with all his being. This is the story of the boy who gazed at the horizon, the scholar who sought wisdom, the missionary who broke idols, and the martyr who offered his life without fear. This is the story of Saint Boniface, the sower of faith, the tireless reformer, the apostle and martyr of Germany. The wind blew softly through the oaks and ash trees of Crediton, deep in the heart of Wessex. As young Winfried, the boy with the thoughtful gaze, walked alongside his father. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and burning wood, and the field stretched as far as the eye could see, dappled by the long shadows of the evening. Barely 7 years old, the small boy watched with fascination as his father carved words onto a wooden board, teaching him the first signs of writing. "Remember, son," his father said, in a firm yet patient voice, "knowledge is like a sword. Whoever knows how to use it conquers more than the one who wields iron." Winfried nodded, but his mind wasn't filled with images of conquest or war. Instead, he imagined monks bent over manuscripts, psalms echoing through chapel walls, and the stories his mother told by the warmth of the hearth. His mother, Edith, was a woman of deep faith. Each night, as the stars began to cover the sky, she gathered her children by the fire and spoke of saints and martyrs who had given their lives for Christ. Winfrid, the youngest, listened wide-eyed. When Edith spoke of St. Andrew crucified on an X-shaped cross or St. Stephen stoned to death, the boy felt those stories pierce his heart like an invisible arrow. "Mother," he asked one night, as the flames cast dancing shadows on the wall, "why didn't they run away? Why didn't they hide to save themselves?" Edith smiled gently and kissed his forehead. "Because they knew their lives weren't just for themselves, but for God. And when someone loves that deeply, my son, they no longer even fear death." Those words were engraved on Winfrid's heart like a seal. As the years passed, Winfrid grew in both wisdom and strength. He wasn't the strongest or loudest boy in the village, but he carried a quiet determination that set him apart. When the time came for formal education, he was sent to Exeter and later to the monastery of Nursling under the guidance of Abbot Winbert. There, among Latin codices, parchment scrolls, and long hours of prayer, Winfrid immersed himself in theology, grammar, and the scriptures. He was a brilliant student. His companions admired his sharp mind and his ability to untangle even the most complex texts. But what truly distinguished him was his humility. He never sought praise, and when someone pointed out his achievements, he would simply smile calmly and say, "All knowledge is a gift from God. I am only a servant trying to understand what he has revealed to us." One day, as Abbot Winbert walked through the monastery cloister, he found Winfrid writing fervently under a tree. "What are you doing, son?" the abbot asked, leaning in curiously. "I'm composing a hymn in honor of St. Paul," Winfrid replied, without lifting his eyes from the parchment. "His zeal for proclaiming the gospel inspires me, Father Abbot. I wish I could burn with that same fire to the very end." The abbot watched him silently, moved by the young man's passion. "You will burn, Winfrid," he said at last, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But God's fire does not destroy. It purifies, strengthens, and sends forth." The abbot's words would prove prophetic. In the years that followed, Winfrid became a teacher and preacher. His homilies were clear, profound, and full of conviction. Monks and lay people alike were moved by the force of his words and his ability to unite teaching with practical life. Yet deep in his heart, there still burned a longing that no task could satisfy, the desire to evangelize lands that had not yet been touched by the light of Christ. Whenever he read about the Germanic tribes, their dark forests filled with idols, their druids and sacrifices, something inside him ignited. He didn't see a barbaric people to fear. He saw brothers who had not yet heard the words of the gospel. One night, while praying alone in the chapel, he lifted his eyes to the crucifix and whispered, "Lord, if it is your will, send me. Here I am, ready to go." The silence that filled the space was so deep, he could almost hear his own heartbeat. Within, he felt an immense peace, as if an invisible hand were blessing him. He knew without any doubt that his destiny was calling him beyond the sea. And so ended the first chapter of Winfrid's life, not as a man satisfied, but as a spirit on the move, a heart ready to leave everything behind for a mission he was only beginning to glimpse. With his eyes fixed on the horizon and his faith stronger than ever, he prepared to set out on the journey that would transform not only himself, but an entire nation. The northern wind blew cold and sharp over the coasts of Frisia, where the stormy sea crashed against the rocks with a roar that sounded like an ancient lament. Winfrid, wrapped tightly in his rough woolen cloak, stood firm on the deck of the small boat carrying him from the British Isles. Around him the sailors worked with calloused hands and hardened faces, casting him furtive glances. What was a monk doing crossing these icy waters? Why leave behind the safety of nursling, the esteem of his brothers, to venture into an unknown land? But Winfrid didn't look back. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the gray mist barely revealed a low, muddy shore. There awaited Frisia, a land of pagan chieftains, fierce druids, and wooden temples dedicated to ancient gods, a land where the cross had yet to take root. When he finally set foot on shore, he felt the wet sand beneath his feet and heard, in the distance, the murmur of unfamiliar voices. He was welcomed by Saint Willibrord, the veteran Irish missionary who had spent years trying to evangelize these lands. Willibrord was already an old man with a graying beard and piercing eyes. "Winfrid, my son," he said, embracing him firmly, "welcome. Here, every soul won is a victory against 1,000 shadows." The days that followed were grueling. Winfrid accompanied Willibrord from village to village, preaching to men hardened by war and superstition. He saw how the pagans mocked, how the druids whispered threats, how the tribal leaders looked down with contempt at every word spoken in the name of Christ. One afternoon, as they shared a piece of bread in the dim light of a small hut, Willibrord looked at Winfrid gravely. "These people are wild, brother. We've brought them the gospel, but they don't want it. They prefer their oak gods and bloody sacrifices. I don't know how much longer I can endure." Winfrid lowered his head, feeling frustration boil inside him. He had dreamed of these lands, crossed the sea with a heart full of hope, but here, amid the swamps and hostile stares, everything seemed to fade away. One night, while praying alone beneath an ancient oak, he lifted his gaze to the starry sky. "Lord," he whispered, "have you brought me here only to fail? Or is this a trial I must pass through?" The wind rustled the branches overhead, and for a moment he thought he heard in the whisper of the leaves a gentle voice. "Be patient. It is not yet time, but it will come." Soon after, Willibrord was called to other lands, and Winfrid, seeing the political instability shaking the region, realized he couldn't remain. The struggles between the Frisian chieftains and the Franks, the betrayals and the wars, made missionary work impossible. With a heavy heart, he decided to return to England. When he set foot once again in his homeland, his brothers at Nursling received him with joy but also with puzzled looks. "What happened, brother?" asked Abbot Winbert gently, careful not to wound him. Winfrid lifted his gaze, his eyes shining not with sadness, but with determination. "I have learned that to truly do the work of God, I need His full blessing. I will go to Rome. I will ask the Holy Father for His mission and His word. And when I return, it will not be as a simple monk, but as a messenger of the Church, armed with the authority of Peter." The abbot looked at him with amazement, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Then go, my son. Go and fulfill your destiny." And so, on the threshold of his 40s, Winfrid set out once again, not to surrender, but to seek, in the cradle of Christianity, the strength and legitimacy he needed. Behind him lay the shores of Frisia, the defeats, the failed attempts. Ahead stood Rome, with its marble columns, its resplendent churches, its pope waiting with open arms, and within Winfrid's heart a new name was already beginning to echo, though he did not yet know it. Boniface, the one who would do good, the one who would sow faith where no one else dared. The rolling hills of Italy stretched before Winfrid's eyes like an ancient dream. After weeks of travel, at last, the majestic walls of Rome rose under the blue sky, crowned by the golden crosses of its basilicas. He had never before set foot in this holy city, yet as he stepped onto its stone streets, he felt each stride bringing him closer to the very heart of the church. Accompanied by other pilgrims, Winfrid walked through the bustling avenues packed with merchants, soldiers, and monks until he reached the Vatican. There, surrounded by marble and frescoes, he awaited his meeting with the successor of Peter, Pope Gregory II, a man he had never met, but whose name he had spoken countless times in his prayers. The meeting was brief but decisive. "What is your name, son?" the Pope asked, his serene eyes studying the English monk. "I am Winfrid, Holy Father," he replied, bowing respectfully. "I come from England, the land of the Saxons, and I wish to bring the gospel to the peoples of Germania, where darkness still reigns. But I do not want to go as an adventurer. I want to go as a messenger of the Church, with your blessing." The Pope studied him in silence for a moment. Then a faint smile crossed his face. "From today you shall be Boniface," he declared. "The one who does good, the one who sows light. Go where God calls you, and take with you this gospel and this cross as signs of your mission." Boniface received the objects with trembling hands. In that moment, he felt a chapter of his life closing. He was no longer just an Anglo-Saxon monk. He was now an apostle commissioned by Rome, backed by the authority of the Universal Church. In the following days, he prepared to depart for the Germanic lands, but first he spent long hours in prayer at the tomb of Saint Peter. There, in the silence of the basilica, he begged the apostle to accompany him, to intercede for him in the trials to come. "Do not leave me alone," Boniface murmured. "Be my companion on this path I am about to take." The echo of his words seemed to vanish among the marble pillars, but within his heart he felt an unexpected warmth, as if someone had laid a hand gently on his shoulder. When he finally left Rome, he carried not only scrolls and relics, but a renewed inner strength. He knew that returning to Frisia, to Hesse, to Thuringia, would not be easy. The pagans would not welcome him with open arms, the Druids would not yield without resistance. But now, with the Pope's backing, Boniface could stand not as a timid outsider, but as an apostle with authority. In his letters, he would later write, "I do not fear threats or death. My trust is in the Lord, who has called me and upholds me." The journey north was long, crossing lands of hills and forests where stone castles were just beginning to dot the medieval landscape. Boniface traveled with a few faithful companions, and each night, as they lit the fire beneath the stars, he spoke to them of their mission. "We have not been sent merely to preach words," he told them, "but to bear witness with our lives. We may not see the fruit of what we sow, but God will make it grow in His time." At last, they arrived in Hesse, where the people still worshipped the ancient forest gods. There, Boniface made a decision that would seal his name in history. He went to Geismar, where the locals venerated a massive oak dedicated to Thor, the god of thunder. "Do you know what you're doing?" some local Christians whispered nervously. "If you touch that tree, the people will kill you. It's sacred to them." Boniface, axe in hand, lifted his gaze to the oak, towering like a colossus in the clearing. He took a breath, closed his eyes, and prayed. "Lord, show them that only you are the true God." With a firm stroke, he drove the axe into the bark. A horrified murmur rippled through the crowd. Boniface struck again and again, until the wood groaned, trembled, and fell. The silence that followed was absolute. No lightning, no thunder, no punishment came down from the skies. The faces of the Germanic villagers and chieftains twisted in shock. Their god had been challenged, and nothing had happened. Slowly they began to whisper, to draw closer, to listen to the calm-faced man who spoke of a single God, creator of heaven and earth. Thus began Boniface's true mission in Germania. Not merely to cut down trees, but to tear down fears, to break the chains of superstition, and in their place, to plant the cross of the gospel. And from Rome, word reached Pope Gregory II, who smiled as he read the reports from his apostle. "Boniface, my son," he murmured to himself, "you shall be the sower who will turn the pagan forests into fields for the Lord." The morning mist rose over the forests of Hesse, wrapping the treetops in a silvery veil. Boniface moved along the narrow trails, accompanied by a small group of monks. Every step was a challenge, crossing wild lands where wolves prowled and bandits lurked, and at the same time facing the invisible trials of the soul, discouragement, fear, loneliness. Yet in Boniface's eyes burned the unwavering flame of conviction. One morning, as he organized his companions in a clearing, he lifted a freshly carved wooden cross. "Here," he declared firmly, "where once stood a pagan altar, we will build a chapel dedicated to the true God. Here we will plant the faith." The monks looked at him, some with enthusiasm, others with doubt. Stories of rebellious local tribes swirled among them like a restless wind. But when Boniface raised his gaze to the heavens, he radiated a certainty that gave them back their courage. In the years following his official commission from Rome, Boniface did not rest a single day. He founded churches, organized communities, taught new converts, and above all trained a new German clergy capable of sustaining the faith in these difficult lands. He knew that without formation, without deep roots, faith would be like a seed thrown among rocks. "We need monks who are teachers and shepherds," he told his companions, "not just passing preachers. We must leave something here that will endure when we are gone." It was then that one of his dearest projects was born, the monastery of Fulda. On a vast plain surrounded by gentle hills, Boniface saw the perfect place to establish a spiritual center. He called upon Saint Sturmi, one of his most faithful disciples, and spoke to him under the shade of a fallen oak. "Here, brother, we will build a place of prayer, study, and hospitality. It will be the beating heart of the church in Germania, a beacon to illuminate these dark lands." Sturmi nodded, his eyes shining with excitement. In just a few years, Fulda became a center of culture and faith, where copyist monks, theologians, and preachers formed a network that sustained the Christian expansion. But not everything was peaceful. Boniface had to face resistance not only from pagans, but also from certain lukewarm Christian nobles, more interested in preserving their privileges than embracing a living faith. At the synods he organized, Boniface spoke with frankness. "It is not enough to call oneself Christian while living like a pagan. We must purify the church of superstitions, of corrupt practices, of ignorance." These words earned him both admiration and enemies. Some local leaders saw him as an uncomfortable reformer, a foreigner who came to shake long-established structures. But Boniface did not stop. With letters full of passion, he wrote to Rome, informing the Pope of his efforts, asking for counsel, strengthening the bond between the Germanic Church and the See of Peter. One night, after an exhausting day of visits and preaching, Boniface sat beside St. Lullus, his closest disciple. Together, they watched the stars twinkle in the night sky. "Master," Lullus asked softly, "do you not fear that one day they will hate you so much they will want to kill you?" Boniface looked at him, smiling gently. "Fear is always with us, my son. But if the Lord calls me to give my life for him, would that not be the greatest glory?" Lullus fell silent, engraving those words in his memory. Thus, between foundations, reforms, and letters burning with apostolic zeal, Boniface wove a strong network that would withstand the storms of time. He knew that the fruits would not always be seen immediately, but he trusted that the seed was well planted. In Rome, the Pope followed his news attentively, sending him letters of encouragement. From the British Isles, monks and nuns joined his mission, bringing with them books, chalices, liturgical ornaments. It was as if the entire church felt drawn into the passion of this man who, in the cold and wild lands of Germania, lit the fire of the gospel with his very presence. The decade advanced, and Boniface knew the task was far from complete. Yet every church raised, every community formed, every heart converted was for him a silent victory that echoed in heaven. The sower of faith did not rest, for he knew the harvest was plentiful and the laborers few. The bells rang out across the hills of Mainz, pealing loudly under a blue sky that seemed to clear just for the occasion. Boniface, now with silver hair and a face lined by years of toil, knelt before the altar, surrounded by bishops, monks, and faithful. The Pope had decreed his elevation. From that day on, Boniface would no longer be just a humble missionary. He would be archbishop, papal legate for all of Germania, with authority to organize, correct, and consolidate the newborn church in those turbulent lands. When he rose, staff in hand and heart overflowing, his eyes sparkled with emotion. "This is not a personal honor," he whispered to his disciple, St. Lullus. "It is a heavier cross, but if God wills it, I will carry it with joy." The new responsibility transformed Boniface into a figure of reference, not only spiritually, but politically. Kings and nobles, Frankish princes and Germanic chieftains sought his counsel, his blessing, his mediation. The letters he sent to Pope Gregory III and later to Pope Zacharias showed his practical wisdom, his sharp understanding of political struggles, and at the same time his absolute loyalty to Rome. In the synods he organized, Boniface reformed the clergy, expelled the unworthy, ordained new, well-prepared priests, and forbade superstitious practices that mingled with Christianity. He was a man of rigor, but also of tenderness. When he wrote to the nuns of Wimborne in England, thanking them for sending new missionaries, his words were filled with affection, almost fatherly. "You are the roses of Christ," he wrote in one letter, "whose fragrance reaches even these distant lands." But not everything was bright. Boniface soon realized that the greatest dangers did not come from armed pagans, but from within the church itself. Ambitious clergy, nobles who wanted to control bishoprics, heresies beginning to take root in the most remote corners. Sometimes exhausted, he would retreat to his monastery at Fulda, kneel in the chapel and whisper, "Lord, how can I carry this burden? Give me strength, for I cannot do it alone." And always deep within his soul, he would feel that soft, familiar voice. "I am with you, Boniface. Do not fear." During these years, Boniface also established an indirect connection with the future giant of Europe, Charlemagne. Though the king ruling at the time was Charles Martel, Charlemagne's father, Boniface helped lay the spiritual and organizational foundations that would later support the Carolingian Renaissance. It was as if the old apostle was building, unknowingly, the foundations of an entire civilization. One day, sitting with St. Lullus and other companions, Boniface shared a reflection he had long held in his heart. "We do not know how much time we have left, my children. But I tell you, everything we do here is not only for our time, but for the centuries to come. When future generations look back, may they see that there was a time when the faith took root here because some dared to sow." Lullus, deeply moved, nodded in silence. The years began to weigh heavily. Boniface's body no longer responded as before. Sometimes, while writing letters or preparing sermons, his hands trembled slightly, but his mind and spirit remained sharp, firm, determined. He knew the time was coming to pass on the torch. He had trained disciples, left behind solid structures, planted monasteries, and given all he had. Yet within him, there remained one last desire: to return to Frisia, the land where years ago he had begun his mission, but had not been able to complete the work. "I want to go back," he told Lullus one day, as the disciple looked at him in disbelief. "I want to return to Frisia. There, if God wills it, I will complete my course." Lullus tried to dissuade him. "Father, you are already an old man. Your place is here, guiding the church. Why go to a dangerous place where they hate you and lie in wait for you?" Boniface smiled with that calm known only to those who have made peace with their destiny. "Because one does not choose where one's seed will bloom, my son. One only casts it to the wind and trusts God to make it grow." And so, as Europe began to take shape as a continent in transformation, as kingdoms rose and fell, as the church grew under his shadow, Boniface, the old apostle, prepared for his final mission. He sought no honors or glory. He only wanted to fulfill to the very end what he had promised in Rome so many years ago, to be a sower, a light, a witness of Christ's love among those who had yet to know him. And with that burning purpose in his heart, he set out for Frisia, unaware that there, among swamps and ambushes, his martyr's crown awaited him. The mist lay thick over the canals and marshlands of Frisia, cloaking the land in a dense, almost ominous silence. The barges moved slowly, their oars dipping into dark waters, while the marsh birds fluttered nervously above the reeds. At the front, standing by the mast, Boniface, aged, stooped by the years, yet with eyes still burning with purpose, gazed out at the horizon. Beside him, St. Lullus watched with a mixture of respect and concern. "Father, we've heard rumors," he said quietly. "They say the pagans are waiting for us in Docum. They don't come to listen. They come to kill." Boniface slowly turned his head and placed a hand on Lullus's shoulder. "Isn't that why we came, my son? To bear witness? The martyr does not seek death, but neither does he flee from it when it is for the love of Christ." The young man swallowed hard, nodding with a tight chest. They arrived at Docum at dawn. The sky was just beginning to blush pink as they came ashore. Boniface and his companions, monks, deacons, brothers of the mission, set up a small camp on the outskirts of the village. They brought out the Gospels, arranged a simple altar under an oak tree, and began preparing for the baptism of new converts. But something felt wrong. The villagers did not approach with their usual mix of curiosity and caution. The paths were empty, the doors shut, the silence too heavy. And then, like a dry crack of thunder, came a shout. From the woods and the reeds surged armed figures, pagans with spears, axes, and war cries, determined to destroy the intruder who had dared challenge their gods. The monks stirred, some reaching for stones, sticks, anything to defend themselves. St. Lullus ran to his master. "Father, we must flee. We can resist, hide, fight." But Boniface raised his hand calmly, and his voice rang clear over the chaos. "Number, we will not lift weapons. We are heralds of peace, not warriors. Today we will bear witness with our blood." He took the book of the Gospels and raised it high above his head like a shield. His face was peaceful, almost radiant. "Lord Jesus, receive my life. All that I am, all that I have done is for you." The first pagans burst into the clearing, weapons raised. The monks knelt in a circle, singing psalms, their voices shaky at first but gradually gaining strength, like a flame that refuses to be extinguished. Boniface remained standing, the gospel held high, as the shadows fell upon him. The blow was swift, brutal. The old man fell to his knees, still clutching his book, as blood stained the grass. One by one, his companions were struck down, but none ran, none denied. When the attackers finished their slaughter, they stood staring at the bodies. Something about the scene unsettled them. There had been no resistance, no hatred, only a serenity they could not understand. One of them approached Boniface's body and tried to snatch the book from his arms, but as he touched it, he recoiled, trembling, as if an invisible force pushed him back. Fearful, he retreated. The sun rose slowly as everything fell silent. The bodies of the martyrs were found days later by local Christians. They wept, yes, but not in despair. They knew that this man who had crossed the sea, challenged the forests, founded churches and monasteries, had not been defeated. He had claimed his eternal crown. St. Lullus, miraculously surviving, gathered his master's remains and carried them back to Fulda. There in the monastery Boniface had founded, they laid him to rest, transforming it into his tomb, his shrine, and the spiritual heart of Germania. And so, under the vast sky, among the echoes of the psalms they had sung as they died, Boniface gave his life, not as a failure, but as the final seed planted in blood that would blossom across generations of faith. The bells of Fulda rang softly as evening fell, casting long shadows over the graves of the monks. Beneath a simple mound, covered in wildflowers, rested the remains of Saint Boniface, the Apostle of Germany. Pilgrims came from distant lands, barefoot, weeping in silence, kneeling to touch the earth where the man who had brought them the faith now lay. The monastery he himself had founded had become a beacon for all of Europe. From its cloisters emerged new missionaries, new apostles, crossing mountains and rivers, carrying with them the fire Boniface had ignited. The manuscripts copied by the monks, the schools they established, the churches rising in forgotten villages, all bore his imprint. All were the legacy of his tireless labor. The centuries marched on. Empires rose and fell, kingdoms changed hands, but Boniface's name endured. In the hymns sung in churches, in the chronicles of the monks, in the tales told by pilgrims, his figure shone like a lighthouse. He was not only the fearless missionary who felled the sacred oak of Thor, nor just the tireless reformer who purified the Church of Germania. He was the saint who had offered his life down to the last drop out of love for Christ. In Rome, the popes remembered him as one of the greatest heralds of the faith. In England, his homeland, monks invoked him as a protector. In Germany, every cross raised on the hills, every bell ringing in the villages, was an echo of his voice, a testimony to his presence in those lands. It is said that on quiet nights, when the wind blows through the pines of Fulda, some monks have claimed to hear his voice, whispering in the darkness, "Do not be afraid, my children. The harvest is still plentiful, and the laborers are few. Be faithful, be brave. The light will not be extinguished." And so, generation after generation, the flame Boniface lit has continued to burn, shining across the centuries, inspiring kings, humble farmers, monks, and preachers. His life, woven from sacrifice and love, was not a fleeting lightning bolt, but a sun that illuminated an entire age. Today, Saint Boniface is still remembered as the Apostle of Germany, the bridge between Anglo-Saxon faith and continental Europe, the tireless sower who watered with his blood the fields where a renewed Christendom would grow. His story reminds us that true greatness does not lie in conquering lands or amassing treasures, but in offering one's life in the service of love, truth, and faith. May his example continue to resonate in our hearts, and may we, like him, learn to look to the horizon, cross the seas of our doubts, tear down the idols of our time, and embrace with all our hearts the eternal call that God places before us. Saint Boniface, Apostle of Germany, sower of faith, martyr of Christ, pray for us.